5 true horror stories narrated by taxi drivers. Story 1. The Little Girl in the Cemetery. Luis had been driving his taxi since early morning, navigating through Mexico City's bustling streets. By evening, the skies opened up with a torrential downpour. It was one of those nights when the rain seemed endless and visibility was poor. Luis decided to take one last fare before heading home. As he drove past a crowded intersection, he spotted an elderly woman waving desperately under an umbrella. She was drenched despite her efforts to stay dry. Luis pulled over, and as she approached, he noticed a small girl trailing behind her, clutching the edge of her black coat. "Please take us to my house," the woman said hurriedly as they climbed into the car. Luis nodded and started driving. The little girl sat silently beside her mother in the back seat. She had pale skin, wide brown eyes, and bangs that framed her face. Something about her presence unsettled Luis, but he brushed it off as fatigue from his long day. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, Rosa began to cry softly. Luis glanced at her through the rear-view mirror, but decided not to pry. After a few moments of silence, she spoke up. "My daughter Anna hates thunderstorms," Rosa said quietly. "She always clings to me when it rains like this." Luis glanced again at the little girl through the mirror. She sat motionless, staring out of the window at the rain streaking down the glass. "Kids are like that," Luis replied awkwardly. "They get scared easily." Rosa didn't respond, but continued to wipe tears from beneath her sunglasses. As they neared Rosa's home, she suddenly gasped and slapped her forehead. "Oh no! I left my phone at my daughter's mausoleum earlier today," she exclaimed. Luis hesitated, but agreed to take her back to retrieve it. He turned onto a narrow road leading to an old cemetery on the outskirts of town. The rain intensified as they approached its gates. "I'll be quick," Rosa said as they stopped near a cluster of graves under a large banyan tree. She stepped out into the rain and hurried toward one of the mausoleums. Luis waited in silence for a few moments before realizing something strange. The little girl was no longer in the car. Panicking slightly, Luis stepped out of his taxi and looked around. There was no sign of Anna anywhere in the cemetery or nearby streets. When Rosa returned moments later with her phone in hand, Luis immediately asked, "Where's your daughter?" "She's not in the car." Rosa froze mid-step and stared at him with wide eyes. "What are you talking about?" she asked shakily. "The little girl who got in with you, your daughter." Luis insisted. Rosa began trembling and tears streamed down her face despite the rain, soaking her already wet clothes. "You saw Anna?" she whispered. Luis nodded slowly, confused by her reaction. "She's been gone for 5 years," Rosa said through sobs. "She died in an accident right here on this road." Luis felt his stomach drop as cold dread washed over him. He stumbled back into his car while Rosa knelt by one of the graves. A small headstone adorned with fresh flowers and Anna's name etched into its surface. Shaken to his core, Luis drove Rosa home in silence after she composed herself enough to leave the cemetery. As they pulled up to her house, Rosa thanked him softly but didn't look him in the eye. For days after that night, Luis couldn't shake what had happened. He avoided driving past cemeteries and often found himself glancing nervously into his rearview mirror during late-night shifts. One night, as he parked his taxi outside his home after another long day of work, he caught sight of something or someone reflected in his rearview mirror. A small figure with bangs staring back at him from the back seat before vanishing into thin air. From that moment on, Luis knew Anna's spirit wasn't confined to the cemetery alone. She had followed him home. Story 2. The Haunted Trunk. Javier had been driving his taxi for nearly 15 years. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and he was ready to head home when 2 men flagged him down near a dimly lit intersection. They were carrying a large black suitcase that looked heavy enough to strain their arms. "Can you take us to Old Town?" one of them asked gruffly. Javier hesitated for a moment, Their demeanor was unsettling, but he nodded. The men insisted on placing the suitcase in the trunk themselves, brushing off Javier's offer to help. As they climbed into the back seat, Javier couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The men whispered to each other in low voices throughout the ride, occasionally glancing at him through the rearview mirror. When they arrived at their destination, a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town, the men quickly got out of the car. "Wait here," one of them said before disappearing into the building. Javier waited for several minutes, but grew impatient when they didn't return. Finally, he stepped out of the car and opened the trunk to see if they had left anything behind. To his surprise, the suitcase was still there. He called out to them, but received no response. Frustrated and curious, he decided to inspect the suitcase. As he unzipped it, an overwhelming stench hit him like a wall. Inside was something he would never forget, a dismembered human body wrapped in plastic. Horrified, Javier slammed the trunk shut and immediately called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived and cordoned off the area. Javier explained everything as best as he could while trembling with fear. The police took his statement and assured him that they would investigate. They confiscated the suitcase and began searching for Diego and Mateo, who had vanished without a trace. For days afterward, Javier couldn't sleep or eat properly. The image of the body haunted him every time he closed his eyes. A week later, strange things started happening in Javier's taxi. Late at night, he would hear faint knocking sounds coming from the trunk while driving alone. Passengers occasionally complained about feeling cold spots or hearing whispers during their rides. One evening, as Javier parked his car outside his home, he heard what sounded like muffled cries coming from the trunk. Gathering all his courage, he opened it, but it was empty. The incidents grew more frequent and intense over time. One night, while driving through an isolated road, his radio turned on by itself, playing static at full volume. In his rear-view mirror, he caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure sitting in the back seat for just a split second before it vanished. Desperate for answers, Javier visited a local priest who specialized in cleansing rituals. The priest explained that spirits often linger when their deaths are violent or unresolved. The soul tied to that body may be seeking justice or peace, he told Javier. Following the priest's advice, Javier performed a cleansing ritual on his taxi and prayed for the spirit's release. For a few days afterward, things seemed to return to normal, but then came one final encounter. While driving late one night, Javier heard a voice whisper from behind him, "Thank you," startled but unafraid this time. He glanced into his rearview mirror and saw nothing but an empty back seat. Unable to bear any more reminders of that fateful night, Javier decided to sell his taxi and leave behind his life as a driver altogether. He hoped that by letting go of the car and its dark history, he could finally move on. Though years passed without further incidents, Javier never forgot what happened. Sometimes late at night, when silence enveloped his new life as a shopkeeper, he wondered if that restless spirit had finally found peace, or if it was still out there somewhere, waiting for someone else to uncover its tragic story. Story 3. The Disappearing Passenger. Miguel had been driving his taxi for over a decade in San Diego. It was a quiet Wednesday night, and he was about to end his shift when he spotted an elderly man standing under a flickering streetlight. The man waved him down, and although Miguel hesitated, something about the man felt strange. He pulled over. The passenger was well dressed in an old-fashioned suit and carried a small bag. "Good evening," the man said in a soft voice. "I need to visit a few places tonight. Will you take me?" Miguel nodded, figuring it would be a decent fare for his last ride of the night. The man climbed into the back seat and handed Miguel a list of addresses. The first stop was a modest house in an older part of town. Don Ernesto, as he introduced himself, stepped out of the car with a white envelope in hand. He slipped it under the door without knocking and returned to the taxi without saying a word. This pattern repeated at 4 more locations. Each time, Don Ernesto delivered an envelope without interacting with anyone inside. Miguel grew increasingly curious but decided not to pry. It wasn't his business. However, as they drove between stops, Miguel couldn't shake an eerie feeling. The air inside the car felt colder than usual, and Don Ernesto's presence seemed almost intangible, like he wasn't entirely there. After completing the deliveries, Don Ernesto asked Miguel to take him to a church on the outskirts of town. It was an old building Miguel had passed many times but never entered. As they approached, Don Ernesto spoke for the first time during their journey. "My wife's ashes are kept here," he said quietly. "I'd like to see her one last time." Miguel nodded solemnly and parked outside the church. When he turned around to tell Don Ernesto they had arrived, he was met with an empty back seat. Panic set in as Miguel searched frantically around the car and outside near the church steps. There was no sign of Don Ernesto anywhere. Shaken, Miguel returned home and tried to convince himself it was all in his head. Maybe Don Ernesto had slipped away without him noticing, but something about the encounter gnawed at him. The next day, Miguel shared his experience with Carlos, a fellow taxi driver and close friend. Carlos listened intently before growing pale. "Miguel," Carlos said carefully, "I've heard about something like this before." Carlos explained that just days earlier, there had been news of an elderly man found dead in his home. Don Ernesto. He had passed away alone but left behind farewell letters addressed to his children. Miguel felt as though ice water had been poured down his spine. Could it be that Don Ernesto's spirit had sought him out to deliver those letters? Unable to let go of what happened, Miguel decided to visit one of the addresses where Don Ernesto had delivered a letter. He knocked on the door hesitantly, and a middle-aged woman answered. "Can I help you?" she asked. Miguel explained everything. The late-night ride, the deliveries, and how her address was one of the stops. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she held up an envelope identical to those Don Ernesto had delivered. "This is from my father," she said softly. "He passed away 3 days ago, but this letter appeared under my door last night." Miguel apologized profusely for disturbing her and left quickly, overwhelmed by what he had just confirmed. That night, Miguel couldn't sleep. He kept replaying every detail of his encounter with Don Ernesto in his mind. The cold air in the car, the silence between stops, and his sudden disappearance at the church. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he heard a faint knock on his front door. Heart pounding, he got up and opened it cautiously. No one was there, only another white envelope lying on his doorstep. With trembling hands, Miguel picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Thank you for helping me say goodbye." Tears streamed down Miguel's face as he clutched the note tightly. He didn't know why Don Ernesto had chosen him for this task, but he felt honored and deeply unsettled by the experience. From that day forward, Miguel continued driving his taxi, but always kept an eye out for passengers who seemed out of place. And every time he passed that old church on the outskirts of town, he couldn't help but glance toward its shadowy entrance, half expecting to see Don Ernesto waiting there once more. Story 4. The Forgotten Mother. Raphael had been driving his taxi in Pimpri Chinchwad for over a decade. It was nearing midnight when he decided to take one last fare before heading home. As he passed a dimly lit street, he noticed a man waving him down. The man, Jorge, was tall and disheveled, carrying an elderly woman in his arms. "Can you take us to my aunt's house?" Jorge asked hurriedly. Raphael nodded and got out of the car to open the back door. Jorge gently placed his mother, Dona Teresa, in the back seat and climbed in beside her. Dona Teresa appeared to be asleep, her head resting on Jorge's shoulder. As Raphael began driving, he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something about Jorge's nervous demeanor and Dona Teresa's unnerving stillness made him feel on edge. Halfway through the journey, Jorge asked Raphael to stop at a pharmacy. "I need to buy medicine for my mother," he explained. Raphael pulled over near a small pharmacy and waited as Jorge disappeared inside. Minutes turned into nearly 20, and there was no sign of Jorge returning. Growing impatient, Rafael glanced at Dona Teresa through the rearview mirror. Her head was still slumped forward, but something about her posture seemed unnatural. "Senora?" Rafael called softly. She didn't respond, concerned. Rafael turned around in his seat and gently shook Dona Teresa's shoulder. Her skin was cold, unnaturally cold, and she didn't stir. Panicking, Rafael stepped out of the car and flagged down a passerby for help. Together, they confirmed what Rafael feared. Dona Teresa was not asleep. She was dead. Shaking with fear and confusion, Rafael called the police. When they arrived, they examined Dona Teresa and confirmed that she had been deceased for several hours. "But she spoke to me," Rafael stammered. "She told me her son wouldn't come back." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't comment further. As Rafael gave his statement to the police, they searched for Jorge, but found no trace of him in or near the pharmacy. It became clear that he had abandoned his mother's body in the taxi and fled. The officers later informed Rafael that Jorge had been struggling with mental health issues after his mother's death earlier that day. Unable to cope with her passing, he had carried her body around town before flagging down Rafael's taxi. Rafael was horrified by the revelation, but couldn't shake one detail: the moment when Dona Teresa had seemingly spoken to him from beyond death. In the weeks following the incident, Rafael struggled to return to work. Every time he sat behind the wheel of his taxi, he felt as though someone, or something, was watching him from the back seat. Passengers occasionally commented on feeling cold spots or hearing faint whispers during their rides. One night, while parked outside a convenience store waiting for a fare, Rafael glanced into his rearview mirror and saw a fleeting reflection of Dona Teresa sitting upright in the back seat before vanishing into thin air. Terrified but unable to afford quitting his job, Rafael sought help from a local priest who blessed both him and his car. Although the strange occurrences lessened after that, Rafael never forgot what happened that night or shook off the feeling that Dona Teresa's spirit lingered nearby. Months later, Rafael visited a cemetery where Dona Teresa had been buried after being claimed by her family. Standing at her grave, he whispered a prayer for her peace and forgiveness. As he turned to leave, he felt a gentle breeze brush past him, a comforting presence amidst his lingering fear. Though he would never fully understand what happened that night or why Dona Teresa had spoken to him after death, Rafael hoped that she had finally found rest. Story 5. The Phantom Farewell. It was a quiet, foggy night in Mexico City, and Raul had just finished his last fare of the evening. He was driving home through the dimly lit streets when he noticed an elderly man standing under a flickering streetlight. The man wore a long coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and carried a cane. His attire seemed straight out of another era. Raul hesitated but eventually stopped. The man approached slowly and climbed into the back seat without saying much. "To Teatro Hidalgo," he said softly, referring to an old theater in the city center that had been abandoned for decades. Raul raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Sure thing," he said, starting the car. The drive was unnervingly quiet. Raul tried to make small talk, but Don Arturo only responded with brief nods or murmurs. Through the rear-view mirror, Raul noticed that the man's face was pale and his eyes seemed distant, as if lost in thought. As they approached the city center, Raul began to feel uneasy. The streets were unusually empty, and the air felt heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about his passenger. "Are you sure you want to go there?" Raul asked cautiously. "That theater has been closed for years." Don Arturo didn't respond directly, but instead said, "It's where I belong." When they arrived at Teatro Hidalgo, Raul parked near its entrance. The building was decrepit and shrouded in darkness, its once grand facade now crumbling with age. Chains hung across the main doors and graffiti covered the walls. Don Arturo stepped out of the car without paying or saying goodbye. He walked slowly toward the theater's entrance, his cane tapping against the pavement. Raoul watched him through his side mirror, unsure whether to wait or leave. Something about the man's demeanor made him feel like he shouldn't drive away just yet. After a few moments, Don Arturo stopped in front of the chained doors and turned to look back at Raoul's car, his expression unreadable. Then he vanished. Raoul blinked in disbelief and stepped out of his car. He looked around but found no trace of Don Arturo anywhere, not on the street or near the theater. Feeling deeply unsettled, Raoul drove home in silence. The next day, he shared his experience with Javier, a fellow taxi driver who knew Mexico City's history well. That theater, Javier said after hearing Raul's story, it's been abandoned for decades. They say it's haunted by Don Arturo Herrera. Who's that? Raul asked. Javier explained that Don Arturo Herrera had been a renowned actor in the 1920s who performed at Teatro Hidalgo. During one of his final performances, a fire broke out backstage, killing several performers, including Don Arturo. They say his spirit still lingers there, Javier added. He never got to finish his last performance. Determined to learn more about Don Arturo Herrera, Raul visited Mexico City's public archives and found old newspaper clippings about the fire at Teatro Hidalgo. One article featured a photograph of Don Arturo in costume, and it was unmistakably the same man who had ridden in his taxi. That night, unable to shake his curiosity, Raul decided to return to Teatro Hidalgo. He parked across the street and stared at its darkened facade for what felt like hours. Just as he was about to leave, he saw movement near one of the boarded-up windows. A faint silhouette illuminated by moonlight. It looked like Don Arturo standing inside, gazing out at him. Raul gathered his courage and approached the theater's chained doors once more. As he stood there, he heard faint music coming from inside, a haunting melody that seemed to echo from another era. Suddenly, a voice whispered behind him, "Thank you for bringing me home." Raul spun around but saw no one there. His heart raced as he backed away from the building and hurried back to his car. From that night on, Raul avoided driving near Teatro Hidalgo late at night. But every so often during his shifts, he would catch glimpses of Don Arturo standing near its entrance, a reminder of their eerie encounter and his unfinished story. If you enjoyed these real horror experiences shared by taxi drivers, then do subscribe to Horror Vault to watch our upcoming true horror stories.